Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this very special evening at the Kansas City Public Library with the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, and the Gordon Wu Professor of Engineering at Princeton University, David Billington. The idea for tonight came to me when my friend Kay Runge, who retired recently as the librarian in Des Moines, sent me a speech that Jim Leach, a former chairman of the Banking Committee in the House of Representatives and now the chairman of the National Endowment of the Humanities, had given at the 80th birthday party for Jim Billington in Washington. And he talked about how Jim and David Billington were two of the great exemplars of the humanities in America. And it wasn't just that caught my attention. It also caught my attention, it's partly my inattention, that both David Billington and Jim Billington had been in the Kansas City Public Library before. I hadn't realized that they were brothers, but they had both been here, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get them here together? And I wrote them a letter, and as you can tell, they said yes. Either that or we kidnapped them. I'm not. And so they're here to talk tonight about the importance of the humanities, about the heartbeat of the humanities in America today. And I think this will be an interesting conversation, but also most important conversation for the future, not only of education and the humanities about that future, but also for what we as a public library stand for in the world. One of our ideals is to be a part of a lifelong liberal arts education for our community, and they're not two better exemplars in the world of this than James and David Billington. I've been a reader of Jim Billington's work over my entire adult lifetime, or going back certainly to being an undergraduate at Yale. I believe that he invented a certain form of cultural history, what I would call cultural history as national history. His book, The Icon and the Axe, has been called one of the seminal books of the second half of the 20th century. And my personal favorite is his book, The Fire in the Minds of Men, which is a history of revolutionary ideas in the 18th and 19th century, and which remains, I think, one of the most important books of the last 30 or 40 years. He's been the director, besides being a professor at Princeton, director of the Woodrow Wilson Center, one of the most unique ideas for a presidential memorial, an active day-to-day center of ideas. He's been the Librarian of Congress for 22 years. He's been an advisor to presidents. If only they'd taken his advice, things would be better. And he's run some of the most important scholarly programs, the Open World program, which I hope he'll talk to us about a little bit tonight, and the World Digital Library project, taking advantage of technology today. David Billington is, in a way, another source of what we're doing here tonight. Was a lecture that he gave not only here but at Linda Hall Library about 4 years ago, and both Jonathan Kemper and I heard this lecture at Linda Hall and said we must bring him to the public library to do that, which we did. But also he brought with him a great exhibit on the subject of his lecture, which are the great bridges of the world, the great engineering feats that are great bridges like the George Washington Bridge and others are. And we had that exhibit here. And part of Jonathan Kemper's idea in encouraging Professor Billington to do that was we were under consideration for the new bridge replacing the Paseo Bridge in Kansas City. And Jonathan was afraid, as many were afraid, that we would have, if you'll pardon the pun, a pedestrian bridge, pedestrian design, in any case, for that bridge. And by bringing David to the library, we encouraged the folks at the Missouri Department of Transportation to think a little bit more aspirationally. And we're going to have, courtesy of that design inspiration and also $50 million from Senator Bond, a much better bridge. And I'm going to propose to you tonight that in honor of Jonathan Kemper and David Billington, that we rename the Bond Bridge the Billington-Kemper Bridge. Or the Kemper-Billington Bridge, you decide. But in any case, David Billington has had that kind of effect on the history of design. He's been voted by an engineering magazine one of the 5 most important figures in the history of engineering since 1874. He's been an author of a number of important books. I've got a couple of them here. The Innovators, which we'll be talking about. Big Dams and the New Deal era, a good damn book. He has reinvented not merely the history of engineering in what is a truly famous course at Princeton, but really the education of engineers in this course. And we'll get a little mini version of his course as part of tonight's events. He's also really created a transforming idea, the idea that the study of structures as an art form is what the history of engineering should all be about. The first question that I want to ask, or the first topic that I want to get to, is your history, your background, how you got to become who you are today, really started in your home in Marion, Pennsylvania, with your mother and your father. Could you both talk a little bit about maybe first your father and the living room full of books that you've talked about before?
You're looking at me? I'll start.
I'll look at you, David. Yes, absolutely.
I'm a little older, so I have to take precedence. Well, our father had an unfortunate fact that his father died when he was young, and he had to start work when he was 14, and he was never able to go to college, which was a great sorrow to him because he should have gone to college. He probably should have been a professor of history. So Jim should really talk about that. But one of the features of our youth was the fact that my father would come home. He came home. He was married to my mother for 40 years before she died, but he would come home every night. He never missed a night coming home. It's a rather remarkable record because he traveled some to New York and from Philadelphia and so forth. But he would come home and we would have dinner together, and then my mother would start doing the dishes, and of course that meant my father would race upstairs and have a nap, and then he would get up and we would go to bed, and at about 3 o'clock in the morning, some hour like that, we would sneak downstairs, and he was sitting there reading, and we would have a kind of a seminar together. In the beginning of this, as far as I can remember, I was probably about 8, or Jim was probably about 6 or something. And we would look forward to these mid-morning, late night discussions. And he was reading, and we, of course, as you said, we had a room full of books. We didn't have a big house, but you had a huge number of books. And he would almost always come home with a book. He went to a wonderful secondhand bookstore in Philadelphia called Leary's, and he would come home, and these books would be all lined up, and he would always be reading one or two, and then he would have these discussions. And since I can hardly remember what they were about, but I just remember that we looked forward to them when we were little kids, really. And I think, Jim, you should pick it up from there.
And Jim, you said about your father that there is a difference, I love this phrase, between influencing people and affecting them, and that your father represented the affecting side.
Yeah, so much of life as you pass it, certainly in Washington, D.C., is influence, struggling for influence. But there's that rare person who really affects people. And influence, is something that's like footprints in the sand. They look big when they're there, but the tide washes in and washes them away. But affecting people, getting inside them, makes all the difference. And he affected us with books. I mean, they meant so much to him, and it meant so much to us, he did, that we kind of got into books because, and another thing that it pointed out was the power of intergenerational reading, of the old talking and reading to the young. And he would, I never forget, I never read any poetry, and he once pulled out this old modern library edition of Keats and Shelley, and he pulled it out and said, now you're going to listen to the best poem ever written in the English language. And he read Keats's Ode to a Grecian Urn. And I never forgot it. In fact, it was the first poem I ever memorized. So, I mean, it makes a huge difference. And there was a study it made a few years ago, incidentally, very interesting study. It didn't get the attention it deserved. What is the single factor that will lead you to a most fulfilling life? Not just in terms of power and money and influence, but in terms of happiness and satisfaction and just a good life generally. And it wasn't economic status, it wasn't ethnic origin, it wasn't any of these things. They're all interesting. It was whether or not you were brought up in the proximity of books. Now, that sounds like it's only an accidental thing, but it was very important because our living room, we just had one living room in which we really lived, and it was just filled with books. And he'd use shoe polish on them to preserve them. And later in his life, when somebody asked him for where he'd gone to college for a publication, he said, I was a graduate of Leary's University. Leary's was the used bookstore, and it was also my introduction to scholarship because the books were much cheaper if they'd already been underlined, which is something for librarians, we don't encourage. But I was always fascinated. Why did they underline this passage? And then I'd read on it and say, aha, it's much more interesting what he says on page 83 than what was underlined on page. And that was sort of kind of an infant introduction to scholarship. But it was, again, the personality of him and the fact that books meant so much to him that they tended to mean a lot to us.
And David, your mother was an interesting woman too. But she said when you were in the Navy at the end of World War II, she sent you Jane Austen novels to read in the Navy.
Yeah, I was just a sailor, and you can imagine the colleagues I was with. And here I was reading a book by a woman, and when I read it, the only time I had was when we were in chow line. And so I would stand in line reading Jane Austen, and I told the guy behind me to tap when I would move up. So I read all the novels of Jane Austen when I was 18 years old. My mother's name was Jane, and she had an affinity that way for Jane Austen, but it was an extraordinary experience because one of the things I remember is there were so many words I didn't know. Solicitude, felicity, words like that I think I remember most of them now, but I fortunately found a dictionary somewhere and looked these words up. So it was a learning experience. She also wanted to go to college and wanted to study. I always thought she would probably have been an engineer. Her father was an engineer. I'm an engineer. My daughter's an engineer. But he said, no, that's not what women do. What women do is what was called home economics. So she went for 2 years to Drexel in Philadelphia, but she ended up getting a job with the Curtis Publishing Company, and she ran a laboratory, finally. It was a cooking laboratory, and she invented recipes which she would try out on us. Most of them were wonderful cakes and cookies and things like that, and she also helped co-found a magazine called Jack and Jill. Maybe some of you know that, if you read that when you were small.
Yeah.
We did, certainly.
Jane Austen was important to David. Jim, War and Peace. You read about the same time, World War II. You were reading War and Peace. Yeah, that happened
in World War II. We had another one of these book club versions of War and Peace, and I kept asking people why the Russians were holding out against Hitler, where everybody else seemed to more or less collapse whenever the German army showed up, so one day I picked up this War and Peace. In fact, somebody said, an old Russian said to me, glowered at me when I asked that question. An emigre lived not far away. She said, "Young man, you go read War and Peace." Well, somehow I did. Again, an authoritative older person. I was pretty disobedient in a lot of other respects, but somehow I picked it up and I realized that Hitler was making the same mistakes Napoleon made, and that the war was really won not by the generals. Remember, General Kutuzov, the Russian general, was asleep on the eve of the great battle, and Napoleon was playing with his little hands and doing things. But there was something mysterious within people that actually enabled them to beat. They were repeating this thing. I also learned that you learn more about what's happening in the present from yesterday's novel than from today's newspaper. And that's more true than ever now. If you see how we've become tabloidized in the old media, and it has to be a scandal or it has to be something that's of passing, and it deals, with influence, but doesn't tell you about the things that really affect people. And the novels do. And so that got me into Russia. I mean, I had no Russian background. There were it was a sort of curiosity, and that novel got me interested in what it is that moves history, and what there's things inside people, and it is people in the last analysis, but not necessarily the people you read about in the history books. So that got me interested in my lifelong interest in Russia, and then people started telling me, well, Tolstoy is not the only great writer. There's this guy Dostoevsky. So I picked up one called The Possessed. I thought that was a great title. I thought it was some horror story. And I went through that, and I realized that was predicting in the late 1860s. That's the first novel ever written about systematic terrorism. It explained it in a novel before it became a reality. And later, a decade later, the first group of people in human history to call themselves terrorists emerged in Russia in an eerie resemblance to what Dostoevsky had depicted in The Possessed. So once again, I thought, and I've thought ever since, that understand a country, you have to understand, you're better going to find out from the cultural expression is going to be a better predictor. If you stop and think about the three great events of the last half century, the most important, the explosion of radical Islam, the implosion of the whole Soviet Empire in 3 days in Moscow, the disintegration in many respects of the international so-called globalized economic financial system, none of these were predicted by the economists, the political scientists, the behaviorists who just sort of studied these things. They do great things and discover a lot of things. But those things were predicted by people who knew something about the culture, knew something about what was inside people, what had affected them, and what would affect them, rather than just who was influencing them on issue A, B, C, or D right at this moment. So it was the novels that got us started. Sorry. We're used to talking for 50 minutes, you see.
And you have to...
And you really want to hear him, because the humanists inside the study of engineering as the great accomplishment in America is not normally perceived the way he has construed it, as a historical phenomenon, as something that came from within remarkable individual people. And that's what humanities is all about. Excuse me.
And this is a good transition to David's great course on the history of engineering and his ideas about that. But first, I want to say to the audience, and you're both welcome to respond to this statement, but I've been reading both David and Jim's books, and you can imagine they ended up at the end of World War II after reading War and Peace and Jane Austen's novels at Princeton together. And I think of them in the Firestone Library at Princeton, trading books and trading ideas. And my guess is that they learned as much from each other as they did from any course at Princeton, though that may be my Yale background that says that. But David, talking about these ideas about engineering, in your book, The Innovators, you say that finally the bridge design and this is the man who is the world's great expert on bridges, results not from scientific facts and social factors, but also from symbolic ideas, that these ideas come from individual designers whose image of the bridge transcends all formulas. Your notion of the difference between applied engineering and engineering by design, talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, it's actually better to phrase it applied science.
Applied science.
Rather, because a lot of times engineering is thought to be applied science, that the scientist discovers something and the engineer then grabs onto it and applies it. And we have studied this, particularly my son and I have studied this, but what we found was that, first of all, that the great innovations, the radical innovations in this country that have transformed our lives were done almost exclusively by single individuals, not by teams, not by great industries, not by academics, but by people in practice, and that they had this strong sense of imagination. Now, they were well educated in engineering. They educated themselves often, but they started out with an idea that what they were going to do, and they used whatever mathematics they needed. But normally it was not very complicated when they were doing radical innovations, because they had to think very seriously and very simply about how things worked and how things behaved. So that's what we call the design view, and it characterizes almost all the best engineering. Not a view of looking around for stimulus from science. Science is helpful. You can't live without it. You can't build things without knowing something about science, for sure. But it is an important thing, and it's something that stimulated me to start studying the history of it. I never took a history course in my life in college, only in high school, and I disliked it always because it was names and dates and generals and presidents, and well, that's history, of course, partly, but it didn't ring a bell with me. But once I got to Princeton, then this guy would grab me and say, "You've got to come hear this lecture." That was Jim, of course. And he said, "This guy, Jinx Harbison," they called him these strange names, but is lecturing on Renaissance and Reformation, and it's a wonderful lecture. Or Gordon Craig is a fantastic lecturer about German history and so forth. And so I did. I went to these lectures and even eventually took a course of all things, in Northern Renaissance art by an art historian. And I was lost in the course, but I loved it. Now, that's an interesting combination, but it does lead to curiosity, so the idea that Mr. Kemper has raised is the fact that these two views of the way engineering works are really crucial to understand why the applied science view is limited, and whereas the design view seems to fit historically, even though it is assumed by most people that engineering is in fact applied science. And
so you taught a course that essentially takes engineering and applies the notion of engineering, the building of structures, as an art form to it. Robert Fulton, who plays a great role in this course, you said Fulton himself understood clearly the significance of this kind of thinking. The mechanic, this is Fulton, meaning in today's language the mechanical engineer, he wrote, should sit down among levers, screws, wedges, wheels, etc., like a poet among letters of the alphabet, considering them as an exhibition of his thoughts in which new arrangement transmits a new idea to the world. That's a great way of looking at engineering.
It's not mine, it's his.
It's his, but you taught that. You taught that, and maybe now is a good moment for you to give us an example, a couple of examples of this great history of engineering course, which itself is essentially a part of the liberal arts curriculum at Princeton.
Yeah, there's actually two courses. The one is on structural engineering as art, and the other is on American engineering as a great collection of radical innovations that transformed the world. So you want me to show a few pictures?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? And if I'm in the way for anybody, just let me know.
Because I am used to talking in 50-minute increments. That's the academic hour.
He has two governors here, though, so...
That's right. I'll get back. So I want to start with a relatively local bridge. This is, of course, how many people know what this bridge is?
Very good.
All right. Somebody's going to get an A in the course, but it's not far from here. This is the Eads Bridge across the Mississippi River at St. Louis, and it was the first bridge ever built out of steel. It was completed in 1874, and it's still there. It doesn't serve any more of the railroads, which it was designed for, but it's still there, and I believe it's in reasonably good condition. And it's a very elegant design, and it was designed by James B. Eads, and I'm happy to say that it has always been called the Eads Bridge. And up until recently, it was the only major bridge in the world named after the engineer. Almost all bridges are named after politicians. And that's not so. I mean, I'm not opposed to politicians, and they are often responsible for getting things done. So, but we like to hear one. No, there's the bridge in Cincinnati named after John Roebling now. Next slide. What I want to show here, this is an etching by Joseph Pennell, who saw this as worthy of his time as an artist to portray it. And so he was influenced by this bridge, and Eads himself spoke about the bridge from an aesthetic point of view as well as a purely technical point of view. Next slide. This one is a more modern view, and it shows trains still going over it. So I took this picture in the 1970s. And the final slide in this sequence, next one, is this one, because we held an exhibition at Princeton and jointly with the St. Louis Art Museum on the Eads Bridge, the centennial of this great bridge, which carries the name of a single person, and his ideas are expressed brilliantly in a book like this. It's about that size, called the St. Louis Bridge, I guess. You have it in the library, I hope.
Absolutely.
It's one of those... I took a chance on that one, but not much of a chance. But it's a brilliantly written book by a professor. Some professors do that, actually. But and it describes in great detail the controversies around the bridge and the activities of Eads. And Eads had to go to New York to raise bond money for the bridge, and he wrote a report which we had it posted in our hallway for the students to read, because it's brilliantly written and it expresses in very simple graphics language the mind of an engineer and how he came to design this form and use this new material.
He said the bridge should be built with strength, with durability, and beauty with economy.
Bravo.
Good phrases.
Bravo.
I got that from your book, so I just...
Right thing, always. He always picks out the right thing. So, I mean, shall I go on?
Go on, please.
Go on.
Yes.
Okay, yes. I mean, my 50 minutes isn't up yet, so... I will now go back and look at, in a slightly more general way, at just a series quickly of designs, structural designs. Now, I'm a structural engineer. I'm a professional structural engineer. That's my field. That's why the first course I started like this was a structures course. And I'll talk about the second course in a few minutes. But next slide. So what I want to show is this bridge. This is a Swiss bridge. And people often ask me what my favorite bridge is, and it's this one, the Salgina-Tobel Bridge in Switzerland, completed in 1930 by the Swiss bridge designer Robert Maillard. And the last three letters in his name are ART, and that's somehow symbolic of him. He's the first great structural artist in concrete works. And the bridge was to follow up what Crosby said, the bridge was the result of a design build competition, and it was the lowest bid, so it was very inexpensive. It is also extremely light. When you see this, it's a form you would never see normally. It's hollow inside, and it's the hollow box, which was an innovation of Myers, and it has been exhibited in more art museums than any other bridge in the world except for Brooklyn Bridge. Next slide. Brooklyn Bridge is a lot bigger, so that's history. Excuse me. I meant to say that picture I showed you was on the cover of a book on the history of engineering, starting with the pyramids and going up to the computer. And the editor had to figure out what to put on the cover, and he decided to put this bridge on the cover. So now this represents politics, and what this course and the other one does is to serve as an integration of the liberal arts. So history is part of the liberal arts, politics is part of the liberal arts, and this is a book. You see it has the George Washington Bridge on the cover, and it is by Jameson Doig, who was chairman of our politics department at Princeton. So he's a bona fide thing. And he and I worked together. We gave several courses together on engineering and politics, and we wrote a long paper on this bridge, on the engineering and politics of the bridge, which won the highest award from the Society for the History of Technology. And it was an interaction of our ideas together. Next slide. So it's politics and engineering. And the next one is science and engineering. Now, what you see here is what, in my view, is the most elegant, the most dazzling space created by an engineer in the 20th century. It's the Little Sports Palace in Rome. And I gave a lecture at the National Science Foundation, more or less like what I'm showing you here, and they were very happy about the lecture, and they said, would you design an exhibition for our entranceways on the subject of engineering, structural engineering as art. So this is the poster they used, and it's the Science Foundation, and they do support engineering, but it's still a science foundation. And the fact that they would put this in there and have an exhibition, and it was for the year 2000, it's still there. It's no longer in their foyer now. It's in another hall, but they still have that. I wanted to get it back, but they wouldn't give it back. So next slide is, and this is a bridge in Boston. It's designed by Christian Menn, who is a Swiss engineer and who is more or less the successor to Maillard. And Menn designed this bridge as it's so-called signature bridge, but it is designed as part of this Big Dig project. You've heard about the Big Dig, and the Big Dig was estimated to be a $3 billion project, and the last estimate I read is now $22 billion. And that's because it's the wrong form. Not the bridge, but the whole thing. They put it underground, and as you probably know, Boston is a completely landfill city almost, and you don't build tunnels in landfill or in muck. And so they've had terrible problems with it, and that's why it's so costly. It's the wrong form. This is the right form. I mean, they wanted to have a signature bridge, and I think it's more or less the same thing that, fortunately, you're getting in Kansas City. You pay a little more for it. If you decide you're going to get a cable stay bridge, it will cost more, because this is not an inordinately long span, just like the one you're doing. But by making something that is done by a really great engineering artist, it won't be that expensive, and it will be something that everybody's proud of. And this is sort of an icon now for the city of Boston. Next slide. And then to the dams. Now this is, of course, everybody misspells it, and but this is a book that I wrote jointly with a professor of history of technology at Lafayette, and it deals with the intimate connection between engineering and politics, just like Doig and I did with the George Washington Bridge. And so when we're teaching this course on structures, what we're really also doing is we have to get into politics and discuss it in real politics terms, not just something flashy that I try to read up on. So it has to do with art because we put our bridge, as Crosby said, in art museums, exhibited in art museums, and they travel widely. So it's politics, art, and history. And we teach a course that satisfies both the history requirement and a science requirement. Now, this is the second course. The first is the structures course. The second one is the one that deals with all of engineering. And that course, I focused just on the United States. And what astounded me in doing that was the fact that starting with the Industrial Revolution and going up to more or less the end of the 20th century, just about every major innovation that the world has seen was done in America. And I didn't do this for chauvinistic reasons. It just turned out that way. And so by focusing on the United States only in this course, the other course is international, the Swiss and other people. But this is not. It focuses just on the United States. It has to begin in Britain because that's where the Industrial Revolution begins. But anyway, these are examples. This is a book that follows the innovators that he showed, and it deals with the first up to World War II. And I wrote it. I was very proud of what I had written. I handed it in to the Princeton Press, and they turned it down. And so I gave it to my son, who is a PhD in history. He rewrote the whole thing, did the real research, and then they accepted it. And so he's a co-author now, and now he writes with me on everything I do. Next slide. This is the textbook for the structures course, just as the one I just showed was for the other course, the course on old engineering. This is A Bridge in Switzerland by Christian Menn, one of the great bridges, and it is a book that describes in some detail what structural art really is, engineer's art. Next slide. And this is you don't have to take notes on this, but but the students do. But the way to, as Crosby has already indicated, the only way to really understand engineering is from three perspectives: a scientific one, a social one, and a symbolic one. And that means that the engineer's ethos is efficiency. Don't waste materials, but be very conscious of safety. So within that's what we mean when we say efficiency. But the second one, it won't get built unless there is a context for it, and unless it is reasonably competitive. It doesn't always have to be the dirt cheapest, but it has to be competitive. Don't waste money, in other words. Don't waste other people's money. And finally, it must be elegant. And those are all independent. It is not beautiful because it's efficient. The ugliest structures in the world are big trusses, and they're extremely efficient. And economy, just because they're cheap, doesn't mean that they're necessarily elegant. So these are independent things that the designer has to think about. And there's another way of phrasing it. They've got to be competent, of course. They've got to worry about cost. And they've got to fit within and help form the culture. You'll notice that I have to do all things like this alliteratively. Otherwise, I can't remember them. Next slide. Now, you stop me, Crosby, when this is going. Now, I'm showing the slide on the left because this is a slide because we're all conscious today of earthquakes. We can't escape the horror of an earthquake. What you're seeing here is a structure by one of these people. And indeed, I have a brochure I'm going to give Crosby after this that indicates we have a new exhibition ready for travel.
We'll have it here soon.
We would love to see it at Kansas City. And it is by a man who designed that structure, who designed very, very thin structures that are extremely strong. What's happened is everything around this is collapsed in the earthquake, and this is perfect. It's not in any way damaged at all. And so the mystery of that is I give a lecture on that. I won't do it now, although I know you'd love to hear it. But this is another work by this engineer. It's a Bacardi rum factory, and these are structures that are the order of 2 inches thick, spanning of the order of maybe 300 feet in span. No other structure involved, and And they're all in great condition. These works were mostly done in the 1950s, and they're all extremely good shape today. Next slide. There's another one of his structures. This is a chapel. He's an engineer now. He designed the whole thing. It's next slide. And this is the exhibition that came to Kansas City. This happens to be what it looked like at Princeton. And the next slide is another example of art, and that's another designer. You see, it's a very strange-looking building. It's a completely unusual building designed by Heinz Ziesler, who just died, but he's a Swiss. And again, these are not costly, and they are very efficient, and for many of us, they are quite elegant. Now, I think I should stop.
Well, and let me quote you again from your book once again as a segue to asking Jim about essentially the same question. You say that, and this reflects the three modes that you were just showing. The three modes of transformation, nature, politics, and art, represent the three basic studies in the liberal arts: natural science, social science, and the humanities. Modern engineering, to be properly understood, must be studied in the context of these liberal arts. Jim, when you've inherited the mantle, in essence, you've inherited the library, certainly, of Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson used three terms to organize his library: memory, reason, and imagination, much like nature, politics, and art, the liberal arts from his 18th century point of view. Talk to us a little bit about your life in the humanities as a Russian scholar under those rubrics.
Well, as a Russian scholar working in universities before I came to Washington, I really was. Everybody was preoccupied with the struggles of the Cold War, with the Russian economy, Russian politics, and so forth. And by studying those simply as material phenomenon and neglecting the culture, they really missed the big picture of what was happening in Russia. And it was only the people in the culture or who studied the culture who saw that this system wasn't going to end, that it wasn't going to last forever. Now, coming into the library, which was founded, the original library was burned when the British occupied Washington in the War of 1812. It was actually burned in 1814. And then they bought Thomas Jefferson's library. And Jefferson could never, it was too big to be shown in Monticello. So he was piled up the way my library is at home. Books, probably yours is too. The coffee table could barely hold them anymore. And so, But he devised the first system for organizing knowledge in libraries in America, this memory, reason, and imagination. And like David's scientific, social, and symbolic meaning of engineering, it was a way of pulling things together rather than just taking them apart. In the universities today, you have so many departments and so many subdivisions of departments and so many methodological parts of these things that it rarely gets pulled together. But there's something about the human nature that individuals can pull things together. And the history, he's shown that the history of engineering is the history of people who pulled a lot of things together kind of experimentally and really did something that was that spoke to and served people. Now, taking over the Library of Congress, incidentally, we had burned the British Library in Toronto before they burned ours in Washington. So, but we keep a selective view of history, you see here. Anyhow, Jefferson had books in 16 languages. When the first Muslim member of Congress was sworn in a couple of years ago, he was sworn in on Jefferson's copy of the Koran. He was studying Arabic in his old age. He really wanted to cover the whole field of knowledge, and he brought it together in ways we tend to take it apart and leave the parts all lying there instead of bringing it together. So what do we do? What can we do with this enormous collection that's grown from Jefferson? The idea of a universal collection of knowledge, all kinds of knowledge, was built into the Library of Congress. And the first committee of the Congress Joint Committee was the Joint Committee on the Library of Congress. Now, this is by far the world's largest library. We have books in 470 languages, all world's biggest collection of movies, maps, music, you name it. It's not just books. So what do we do with this? Well, one of the things we did was that you have to get. How do you get this out to the American people? How do you get the fullness of creativity? Well, along comes the internet, and you have this magical possibility that you can unify things on the internet. You can have the story of America. So we have now put online 16 million digital files, and they're almost all primary documents of American history, not primarily books. And that has the capacity to motivate kids. It's designed, our curators who used to work just for, we have a special curator for the music collection of John Philip Sousa, which is enormous. You have a special collection, just a Lincoln curator. We have some of the great curators. They used to just talk to a very few specialists, and that was good because the books, all the books that were written were influenced by these people. But now they write little commentaries that have to be. My challenge to our curators when we went online, and we're now creating a Library of Congress online as an integrated whole, my challenge to them was pretend your 11 or 12-year-old niece or nephew came in and say, "Hey, Uncle Bob or Aunt Petunia, what in the world, what is all this stuff? Why should I care about it?" And that challenge of specialists meeting ordinary people means that our target audience is now K through 12 rather than just specialists. We serve the specialists too. But this is an exciting thing also because you're bringing things together and you're giving people the elements of the story, which are so we have the presidential papers of all the great founding fathers online. We have Brady's Civil War photographs. We have Edison's early movies, the only movies we have of what America looked like in the 19th century. If you see, and it's all online, if you see immigrants arriving on Ellis Island, this is not your huddled masses. They're proud, walking their first step on American soil, and you just cannot look at that and not be inspired and awed because they're carrying everything they have in one bag, but they've got one nice suit or one nice dress, and they're thrilled to get a new start in this country. So the story of America, now we're moving from the story of America, which is a story told by individual documents, the human documents of history. So that what it does is what is missing in all our debates about education. It empowers teachers. It doesn't tell them what to teach. It gives them the primary documents. You can see Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence and the initial corrections by Adams and Madison and Franklin. I mean, it's a fairly good editorial team. You can see the two variants, including the reading copy of the Gettysburg Address. You can see these things. These are human documents, and they're a good way to begin learning. And it's a good way at home as well as in school, and the internet makes it possible. So, pedagogically speaking, what we're trying to do there is to motivate people to learn and get them asking questions, stimulate their curiosity. And there are no stupid questions. But there's a wonderful phrase that my predecessor, Dan Borsten, used, who's a great American historian. He said, you can get all the information you want from a computer. You can get a lot of information, he said, but only if you eventually get back to books will you be able to ask the unimagined question and accept the unwelcome answer. That's a tremendous definition of a liberal education. And so David, who like me, derived so much from being surrounded by books and being introduced to them in little bits and pieces by our father and mother, are going back into books as a form of expression. And the whole point of our digital learning, now that we involve, we're doing it for the stories of other countries, cooperatively with the national libraries of other countries, this World Digital Library, it's in 7 languages and so forth. The whole point of this is to both inspire people inspire them with the human elements of stories. And what David has done has just showed the story of what the world admires in America. It's technology, it's engineering, but which we don't appreciate ourselves, as how important it is, how much of a human achievement it is, and how that has not only produced things of use to people, but it was the result of a kind of freedom. Article 1, Section 9 of our Constitution talks about promoting the useful arts and sciences. And we've been given the commission, because we have the copyright, the exclusive copyright file of the United States, which is just amazing. 5 million pieces of sheet music copyrighted. That's more than the rest of the world has produced. So this enormous creative country. We have, and having the record of that country out, and now helping other countries reunite their own divided heritages in different libraries all over the world online a little bit. That's a UNESCO project now, is a kind of pedagogy that we think is ultimately a humanistic enterprise, but it includes these other things. And the last thing I want to say is that David's concept, I'm talking a lot, I'm running a big library and all of that, and we do have other projects. I'm even consulting with the Russians now on creating a new library system of theirs. And the argument I'm making, they want to make it just this history of Russian government, power, all these kinds of things. And I'm saying, Russia's a lot more than that. It's this culture. It's ultimately determined. People were not, when they resisted the coup attempt in Russia and brought an end to the Soviet system, they weren't just, they wanted to both experience and discover the technology, the changes that had been happening in the post-war Western world that they'd been denied them, but they also wanted to recover their own cultural identity, their own story. And that story is a human story. And David, by showing that this technology, which has been so long neglected in the writing of history, my profession, that this is a really important part of our history. Why we became the United States and so forth. It was because of the transportation grids and all these things. And this is a part of something we should be proud of. The rest of the world is fascinated by it. They keep coming here to learn it. So, I'm rambling on.
Well,
I'm in danger of 50 minutes. I haven't been giving 50-minute lectures regularly, so you let me out of the stacks and I revert to top. But
you talked about stories, and at some point you've said, I quote you, stories prevail over theories. And that relates also to what David has done in telling the stories of the great engineers and the great builders, that the built environment, the engineered environment, like the environment of Russian history or indeed civilization itself, needs builders, and we have to tell the stories of the builders in order to understand what is built and in order to build more.
Right.
Good. Okay. Well, that was easy. That was easy. Another thing that you've said, Jim, that I want to quote. I think this is wonderful from a lecture you gave an article you wrote in 1968 in Life magazine. There's some here who remember Life magazine. That the humanistic ideal of involving the whole man in the quest for order and beauty is what the humanities are all about. And it seems, again, that's something that you have in common, the two of you have in common, is this notion that beauty is one of the important qualities. That beauty and perhaps truth and telling the story of the builders, that's somehow at the core of the humanities. Is that a fair statement?
I think so, yes, I think so. I mean, for instance, you look at this building. Now, it's a strange-looking building to some, but it contains within it one of the most radical ideas in modern engineering. And the idea is you can build a concrete structure in a harsh environment, and you do not need to provide any waterproofing. This is in the harsh environment, but you can't see the mountains of the Swiss Alps are behind it, but it's 3 inches thick, about 200 feet in span, and it has no waterproofing, just pure concrete, and there's no leaking. I've climbed all over these things to try to find a leak, and they never. He claims he has 2 leaks in his 250 structures like this, but I never found one. And so if I just say a few more things here with pictures. Next slide. This is his most famous building. It's on 7-point supports. It's completely not an organized plan view, but the organization is in his mind about how to build it by hanging a cloth and getting a shape that way. And it's the Sikely building in Geneva. Again, it's approaching 50 years old. It's in mint condition. It has no waterproofing, and it stands there. This is the cover of a second edition of my book on thin shells, where I learned about Easter, so I put it on the cover. Next slide. But it's books again. Of course, it's always important. Now, here's a building, very flashy building. It was given as a gift for the United States to Berlin, to Germany, in the 1950s. And as you can probably tell by now, since I'm instructing you instructors, it's absolutely the wrong form. It's just completely the wrong form. It's a ridiculous form, and I don't know who the engineer was, but they should not have ever allowed such a form like this. So when you see arches on their side like this, crossing, and what do you predict is going to happen?
Next slide.
What?
Fall, leak.
Next slide. There it is. Yeah, it makes no sense, and the structure told everybody. It's a shame because it was designed by a very famous architect, and it was a lot of hoopla when it was there. I was in the building not too long before it failed, and there it is. So next slide. So now I want to show you something. This is a very small little case study, but it's a story. I see this is faded a little bit, but that's all right. It's a bridge in Switzerland by Maillard in 1936, and he was playing with the form. See, it has these supports that look like that, and people say, well, he's a decoration. It makes something that he looks like funny. But down here, it's very hard to see this, so I will actually get up and describe it for you. If I get up, I don't do it so easily. But I want to get up because I want to trace this. You see, this is a shape here like this, like an X. Now, that's the result of this calculation. I don't expect you to read the calculations, even if it were clear. But it is the calculation that leads to this form. And this is what he built. Now, what is he doing there? He's doing what great engineers all do, and that is to reverse the normal phrase you hear. You know, it says, form follows function. That's a wrong statement. It's function follows form. In other words, you make the form so it will function the way you want it to. So that's what he did. He made a form which appealed to him aesthetically, and it works very well because he's controlling those forces. So there's almost no force in the middle, and it goes higher as you go up or down. And this calculation shows what he did. So it's in a scientific sense, science being in this case the analysis of an engineering work. Next slide. But it's also a work of art. This appears on the cover of an Italian art journal, which is stating clearly that this is a work of modern art. It's not my idea at all. And the next slide. Here is my son, who now writes with me, David Jr., and he's looking at it with great awe and wonder. And but now this form, which was designed by Maillard in the 1930s, and right down the street from Maillard was the most famous artist in Switzerland at the time. And there's a term the Germans use like Zeitgeist, which means people in different fields and all will somehow gravitate towards the same kind of work at the same period in the same place. And so it's no accident that this work, next slide, and of course I'm talking about Paul Klee. This is a painting by Paul Klee. Now, Paul Klee didn't copy Maillard. This was in fact done long before Maillard did this. And Maillard never saw this painting. That I am absolutely certain of because I went to visit the owner of this and he gave me the provenance of it, and I knew where Maillard was because I had written about him. And so it is simply something that arises. Klee was, of all the Bauhaus people in Germany, the one most interested in forms of architecture and structure and natural forms. And so it's not surprising that you get this confluence of art and engineering. Next slide. And this is men who did the Zaken Bridge. I'll just show quickly. Next slide. And this is a model of it. And the next slide. And there's the real structure. And this is the Sönniberg Bridge. It's a not very good picture, so it's hard to tell, but it goes across the most beautiful valley in Switzerland. Next slide. And this is then what you see, this light shape here, which has direct structural meaning, but which comes from the imagination of men. Next slide. And then this is the George Washington Bridge under construction. Absolutely the slenderest bridge ever built, really, and yet it's the most heavily loaded bridge. Next slide. Here it is finished. And next slide. The importance of this is another view of the bridge, and the next slide shows the Hoover Dam. Now, this bridge represents very clearly the structuring of the heavily populated metropolis in the United States, and this one was the essential feature that allowed the second largest metropolis, Los Angeles, to grow. It's a long story. I won't go into it in detail. It's in the Dams book. You can run out and buy that book, of course, and then you will find out all about that. And in the next slide, and the last thing I have now is this is the cover of this book that he referred to, and what is important again is people. That's why the people are on the cover there. And just to give you a couple of these, there's an order to what these people are doing, and then there is a tremendous imagination. And how are we doing on time? I won't.
Good, fine.
Good, fine.
Everybody's still awake, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well then I will go and show. I want to show you something about the order of the thinking that goes into these things. And in order to teach about engineering, it's really important to define engineering. And if you ask most engineers, and me even too, before I started on this track, or you ask the general public, they don't really have any idea how to define it. So I'm going to define it for you, definitively. You got your pencils ready? Next slide. All right. Now, again, we use this same triad here, formulas. And the reason we teach formulas is not because we want them to manipulate mathematics, but we want them to see in the most concise way the relationship between the parts of a structure or the parts of a machine. And that's the only way you can do that. You can't do it any other way than but they're very simple formulas, I guarantee you. Next slide. Now, to start this course, I show this because the symbolic side of machines and things like that is much harder to get. And so what I'm showing you is a painting here by Thomas Cole. He was the founder of the Hudson School of Painting. In 1828, he was an Englishman, came as a young man, and he painted this wilderness of a dead tree. It was the way many Europeans saw America, as a kind of an untapped wilderness. No people there, and open expanses and so forth. And then, next slide, 2 decades later, he paints this one. Now, it's called The Picnic, and if you look closely, you'll see it's people sitting there, the children are playing, the men are telling stories, and the women are doing all the work. It's a perfectly natural formula. And my wife has an answer to that one.
Yeah, exactly.
But
she's not here.
She's not here. Yes, she regrets not being here, but she couldn't make it anyway. But the point is, the question is, what is the difference between these two paintings? What is the really important fundamental difference? Well, it's a very easy to answer once you have taken the course. Next slide. The steamboat and the railroad. That is what domesticated. This is domesticated nature, and that's how nature was domesticated by Cole himself. He lived up on the Hudson River after living in New York. This is the Clermont, the famous Fulton boat. Already heard the thing by Fulton, and this is the Lancaster, one of the first drawing of one of the first locomotives built in this country. And what I want to now show is the formulation of the. Thank you. Grazie tantas.
Amateur engineering here. Water power.
Yeah, water is important. So, next slide. So if you build an urban society and you want to think about it, you have 4 great ideas. And these are the great ideas of engineering. This is how you go about defining engineering. Structure, machine, network, process. Each one is different, but each one is still focused on design, but different kinds of designs. Now, these are the machines, of course. They are, in effect, prime movers. That's the major type of machine that we talk about, and they are the type of objects of technology that only work if they move. Only work if they move. Next slide. These are the structures now, 2 structures, and these are only work if they don't move. If the structure starts to move, it's in trouble. Get off of it. If a car can't move, then it's in trouble. So these are the complementary parts, the static and dynamic, mass production for the cars, custom-made designs, public works for the structures, and private industry for the cars. These are not absolute scientific type divisions, but they are the only way to understand what makes up all of technology, all of engineering. These happen to be 2 bridges in Great Britain, the 2 best examples of structural design in Great Britain at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Next slide. This is a network, and this happens to be the electrical power network of the Tennessee Valley Authority. So it's an entirely different kind of thing than a structure and a machine. Those are the objects of engineering, whereas the networks are the systems. This is a system. You put into this system, and out you get something out which you hope will be exactly the same as you put in. There's always some losses, but the idea is that something goes through a network with as little loss as possible. And the next slide shows the 4th idea, the process. And the process is you put something in and you expect to get something very different out. So in this case, this is the oldest of the processes. It's the blast furnace, and it's the making of, there's a mistake in that slide, which I'm sure you caught immediately. You don't put iron in, you put iron ore in there. So we do sometimes miss in the things, but out you get iron out, and you got, there's more complex limestones in there to get impurities. It's more complicated than we described, but the essence of it is you put iron ore in, you put oxygen in, and what you get is iron. And this was one of the foundations of the Industrial Revolution, and it's a process. So these are the 4 great ideas. They will reflect. If you know anything about the organization of engineering schools, you'll know that the 4 major divisions are civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and chemical engineering. And these are the single issues in each one, but there are more in each one, and each one has complications with others. But this is a basic way to formulate in an understandable way what engineering is really about. And next slide. And this is the first great work of the Industrial Revolution, the Iron Bridge of 1779. And therefore, you know how we are as academics. I want to give the students the following question. What is the date when the Industrial Revolution begins? And the date they have to give me is 1779 because of this bridge. Of course, it's much more complicated. People write huge monographs about when the Industrial Revolution begins. But this is an expression of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The first time a structure had ever been built out of iron. And next slide is the last structure, the last major structure built out of iron. The Eiffel Tower is not steel, it's all iron. Eiffel never used steel. And next slide. And this is the book I showed before. And I'm not going to show you, this is in the 19th century. I'm not going to bring you into the 20th century. That's another 12 lectures. And but I just want to point out a couple of names, and that is, we already heard about Fulton, and Fulton was, in fact, an artist. He went to England to study painting, and he found out he was going to be right at the top of the second level of painters, so he gave it up for engineering. But his imaginative capacity, as he describes, is the same. It's the same with Morse, who was also a painter, and he was in the front rank. Morse's paintings are really good. They're still exhibited today at exhibitions, but he gave it up too because he couldn't make a living by that and became an engineer, but his imaginative capacity was very strong. So imagination is very strong. And that stays on today. And I just want to comment on one of the greatest engineers that has ever lived in our country, and his name is Jack St. Clair Kilby. Now, raise your hand if you've heard of Jack St. Clair Kilby. Okay? How many have heard of Thomas Edison? Okay. He's in the same category. The single most important innovation in the last half of the 20th century was the microchip. It was invented by Jack St. Clair Kilby, and he eventually won the Nobel Prize for it. It's pure engineering, but he won it in physics. And in his Nobel Prize lecture, he states, I'm not quoting him, but it's because I don't remember the exact word, he states that he came to work for Texas Instruments. He came to work in the summer of 1958. A few weeks afterwards, vacations were called for by the people, and everybody left on vacation because they all left at the same time. But Kilby hadn't been long enough there to merit a vacation. So as he said in his Nobel Prize lecture then, they took this mass vacation, and I was left all alone with my thoughts and my imagination. And out of those 2-week period came the microchip. And Kilby was an extraordinarily modest man. Edison was anything but modest. And that's the reason your hands go up 100 and some years after Edison, and yet nobody knows Kilby. Where was Kilby from? He was from Kansas. That's pretty close. Pretty close. And he went to the University of Illinois. That's also pretty close. And he worked at Texas Instruments, all in this region. He's not from the East Coast, not one of those fancy people that went to Yale or Princeton. Right?
Well, thoughts and imagination and grand structures, elegant structures. These are all elegant structures. Jim, as we try to wrap this up, talk for a minute about that idea in history and the humanities broadly considered. Have we lost some of that in fragmentation and bureaucratization of the humanities?
Yes, I think we have, and it's partly because we, even in my profession of historian, that we don't see, we've minimized the role of people in history. It's all either big social forces without economic social forces that seem to control everything, or it's glandular forces within that seem to drive individuals. So the people as creative beings, somewhere between the angels and the apes, if you like, in our middle state, that for whom this system was devised. It was devised for imperfect and yet for perfectible people. It was absolutely original. It was the first political system that ever devised, which in the first article of the Constitution calls not just for the useful arts and sciences, but for the responsibility of government to encourage that in its people. In other words, so the idea of the purpose of government is to create the freedom and also the incentives to be innovative. Just before this, we had the speaker, it was a big group of congressmen came over, and we had this in the main reading room of the Library of Congress because we wanted to make sure that even though we're doing all this digital stuff, it begins in books, and that we are the only world culture whose entire institutional formation was made in the age of print. Our values, our tolerance, our sense of the capacities of people, but the dangers of too much power, all these things are amazing things. And we've had very stable system of governance and very continuous use of innovation. The main speaker in the main reading room at the Library of Congress just this time last week was the chief operating officer, or the chief executive officer of Google. And he just kept saying, we need innovation. We need innovation. We need entrepreneurial imagination and innovation. And that is, of course, what David's talking about. But this is where so much of our innovation was. What we don't know is what brought about the innovation. And it was individual people. And this last example that David gives, we wouldn't be able to explore the capacity of the interactivity of the internet to get people stimulated enough to go back to find the material in the books. Doesn't matter whether it's a Kindle or an old book. People are always going to prefer the old, in my view. But that's really where our system was based on. And the original things about America, the capacity to innovate, the fact that government was created and has been, the Congress of the United States has been the greatest patron of the library in the history of the world. Nothing like the comprehensiveness of the Library of Congress. We have enough shelving to reach from Washington almost to Chicago, if they put end to end. It's an amazing thing. But the ability of America that's quite unique is to add without subtracting. But we're in danger of this great infrastructure that we've built, that the engineers have built. One reason we're letting it rot and the money doesn't seem to, everybody talking about infrastructure and innovation. But you only innovate if you preserve what you've got. The unique thing about America is also adding without subtracting. We don't throw away the old books when we get new ones, because you never know. We found, the head of Sloan Kettering told me that they found the clues for the most important breakthrough they ever had in adult remission of leukemia from an old German book of which only one copy survived in the world, and it happened to be in the Library of Congress. It was written in German in the 1840s, and it wasn't even about medicine. You never know what's going to inspire people, but you do know that we have to begin putting things together rather than just taking them apart. And in the bureaucratization of academia in the modern world, we've tended to take the whole business of knowledge and learning into highly specialized languages, private little methodological languages that people talk to each other. The great publisher Alfred Knopf came to the meeting of the American Historical Association not long before he died, and he said, "You're writing more and more for less and less." And in a democratic society, we have to know where we came from, what really, you have to get into the innovative process. How did it actually work? And by David's rediscovering in the pantheon of American heroes, this succession of engineers, he's telling us about ourselves, something the rest of the world knows and envies, but we don't really appreciate. And yet that's what, even with Google, with all its resources and all its things, the guy says, where are the innovators? Where are the innovators? Well, they're in our own history. They made what we are today, and if we're going to be any good tomorrow. And that's the great thing about the American dream, I think. It is whatever the problems of today, with persistence, with a certain amount of freedom, but with a sense of responsibility for your future generations. Whatever the problems of today, you can always make tomorrow a little better than yesterday. And that's what these heroes that David's talking about have done. And that's what I think, that in learning our story better. By the way, we didn't embark on a world digital library until we got the essence of our own story, because you can't appreciate anybody else's story unless you really understand and appreciate your own. And he's opened this whole world to me. I think about cultural history and art and the great breakthroughs and things that are going on inside people that affect people in terms of, they had a scientific, they had an orderly base, but they also had, once it became things, they were social, they changed society, and once they stuck around, they inspired the imagination. So that to me has been an inspiring thing of thinking, not just about the accomplishments of engineering, but about the variety of accomplishments in entrepreneurship and innovation, and all kinds of all the great forms of art. So the humanities really come down to saying that it's human beings that have done these things, and and democracy, humanism, understanding. We have to live increasingly by our wits more than our weapons. It's a much more competitive universe. And we have to, and what we're trying to do, for instance, with this World Digital Library, is to tell is to help tell the stories of other countries, because there very oftentimes we have more on some countries than they have themselves, but we're putting it online. In fact, we didn't want to put a World Digital Library online until we had something from every country in the UN, UNESCO. We found that there were 40 countries that didn't have the capacity to put anything online. There are many people in the world still who've never used a telephone, let alone any of these other. But the idea was virtual repatriation. Everybody in this globalized age, so-called, wants to have something in their story that can be respected by other people. Stories unite people, theories divide them. And the Cold War, which is sort of the major subject of study that I made and worked on and was to some extent involved in a little bit, various stages of my life, was basically the victory of a story over a theory. Communism is a great theory that led to some of the most horrible stories of the 20th century. America was never a theory. It was never, nobody applied a theory. It was a discussion, entirely done with the only world culture whose entire institutional formation was made in the age of print. It was discussions, late night discussions, like the discussions we had with our parents in the presence of books. The first meeting of the Continental Congress was in a library. The first joint commission of the Congress was the Commission on the Library of Congress. And the purchase of Jefferson's Library meant that we were, in 16 languages, we were embarked on preserving the human record in a way that was and still remains quite unique. But if democracy is going to survive and prosper, we have to keep the values of the book culture, even as we get the benefits of innovation and of human imagination, as well as the science, the society, and the inspiration of the human imagination. Those are Jefferson's categories. We have reconstructed, and if you get to Washington, please come and see Jefferson's Library. Part of it was burned. We've had a major effort to reconstruct Jefferson's Library by getting duplicate copies. It was a reading library. He wasn't collecting books for show. He was collecting them to read. And you might want to see that. It's organized in terms of memory, reason, and imagination. And that's not so different from the elements that all went into the amazing record of what the world looks to us for, and that we haven't understood enough of ourselves. So as we understand our own story better, we're able to, in a non-patronizing way, help other countries because of what we've accumulated. We have the British and the French and others also who have things about Africa, Latin America, and Spain, and so forth, cooperating to get the story, other people's stories back. Stories don't compete. Everybody likes somebody else's story. Nobody likes anybody else's theory. And anyhow, I'm grateful to this guy. He is the older brother. We have the same birthday, by the way, just 2 years apart. So for reminding us of a big part of the American story, which the rest of the world sometimes appreciates more than we do, but certainly you in Kansas City have enabled us to talk about this in a very direct human manner, and you are our impresario and master of ceremonies.
Well, as the impresario, I want to open this up to questions, but I want to quote one last time from a speech you gave, I think only a few months ago at St. Andrews, one of the great Scottish, one of the medieval foundation, a Scottish university, in which you talked about books and the value of book culture, as you just said, and you said, books are guardians of our memory, tutors in language, pathways to reason, and our golden gate to the royal road of imagination. And I want to say that the two of you are in my pantheon of heroes for being guardians of memory and taking us on the royal road of imagination. So thank you so much for being here.